The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Mr. Max Blumenthal, journalist, founder, and editor-in-chief of The Gray Zone. Mr. Che Baus, scholar specializing in small arms and munitions. And Mr. Sergei Radchenko, Wilson E. Schmidt Distinguished Professor, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Since the last briefing to the Security Council on this topic in May this year, the provision of military assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine has continued in the context of full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. Information on transfers of weapon systems and ammunitions flows from governments are available through open sources. These transfers have included heavy conventional weapons, including battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircrafts, helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions, small arms, and light weapons and their ammunition. There are reports that the supply of arms and ammunition has accelerated and expanded ahead of the reported counteroffensive by Ukrainian forces. There are also reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons, such as uncrewed combat aerial vehicles and ammunition, to the Russian armed forces for use in Ukraine. Moreover, media outlets have reported on the transfer of major conventional arms, including artillery rocket systems, to other armed groups involved in the war in Ukraine. The supply of weapons into any armed conflict situations raises significant concerns about the potential escalation of violence and the risks of diversion. Measures to address the risk of diversion to unauthorized end users and for unauthorized users are essential for preventing further instability and insecurity in Ukraine, the region, and beyond. Such measures include pre-transfer diversion risk assessments, end-user certificates, and non-retransfer clauses, effective legal and enforcement measures, and post-shipment verifications. To prevent the diversion of weapons, supply chain transparency and cooperation and information exchange between importing, transit, and exporting states is required, as well as concrete measures such as marking and tracing, effective accounting and record-keeping practices, physical safeguarding of arms and ammunition, customs and border control measures, and diversion monitoring and analysis. As I mentioned many times before, transparency in armament is a crucial confidence-building measure, which can serve to reduce tensions and ambiguities between member states. The UN Register of Conventional Arms is a key instrument in this regard. Moreover, the Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and its international tracing instrument are some of the arms control instruments that have been established by states to prevent the diversion of conventional arms and regulate the international arms trade. Taking this opportunity, I welcome the recent conclusion of work by Open-Ended Working Group on Conventional Ammunition and commend the elaboration of a new global framework for through-life conventional ammunition management. The framework is a much-needed instrument to more effectively counter the diversion of conventional ammunition of all types, which continue to fuel instability, insecurity, and conflict across the world. I reiterate my call to states to join relevant treaties and agreements and to fully implement their legal obligations and political commitments under conventional arms control instruments to which they are party, to minimize the risk of diversion of arms and ammunition. The establishment of the Unified Weapons Register by the Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs and Police, designed to digitize registration, accounting, and control activities associated with civilian firearms circulation, is a timely initiative to minimize diversion risks. Mr. President, the impact of the intensifying war in Ukraine on civilians continue to be an area of serious concern. From 24th of February 2022 to 18th of June 2023, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 24,862 civilian casualties in Ukraine, with 9,083 killed and 15,779 injured. The actual figures are likely to be considerably higher. The vast majority of civilian casualties are a result of the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects. The missile attack in central Kramatorsk on 27th of June, which killed 12 people, is a case in point. The Secretary General has unequivocally urged all sides to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, as such use is highly likely to result in indiscriminate harm. I take this opportunity to refer to the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, adopted in November 2022. In addition to the thousands of civilians killed and injured, the continued and intensified attacks against critical infrastructure and essential services, including energy infrastructure, health and educational facilities, roads and bridges, is alarming. Mines and explosive remnants of war have resulted in widespread land contamination, rendering land unusable for agriculture, while impeding the movement of people. The destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant dam is possibly the most significant incident of damage to civilian infrastructure since the start of the war. Under international humanitarian law, parties to an armed conflict are prohibited from targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure and have the responsibility to take all feasible precautions in the conduct of military operations to avoid or at least minimize incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. The United Nations strongly condemns attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and call for their immediate cessation. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the past 16 months has seen immense loss, suffering, and devastation in Ukraine. As the conflict has intensified, diplomatic efforts and initiatives by member states seeking de-escalation and calling for a peaceful settlement have also increased. The United Nations stands ready to support all meaningful efforts to bring a just and sustainable peace to Ukraine. In this, we are guided by international law, including the Charter of the United Nations and relevant General Assembly resolutions, as the Secretary General has repeatedly emphasized. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Ms. Nakamitsu for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Max Blumenthal.
Thank you, and I thank Alex Rubenstein and Wyatt Reed for helping me prepare this address. Wyatt Reed is a journalistic colleague of mine who, in October 2022, happened to be in Donetsk when his hotel was shelled by the Ukrainian military with a apparently U.S.-made howitzer, nearly killing him. He was 100 meters away. I'm also here with my friend, the civil rights activist Randy Kretiko, who was more recently in Donetsk and witnessed regular HIMARS attacks on civilian targets. I am here not only as a journalist who has spent over 20 years writing books, producing documentaries, and writing articles about conflict and politics from several continents. I'm also here as an American taxpayer who's been dragooned into funding a proxy war that has become a threat to the regional and international stability at the expense of my countrymen and women. Just June 28th, as emergency crews worked to clean up yet another toxic train derailment in the United States, this time on the Montana River, further exposing our nation's chronically underfunded infrastructure and its threats to our health, the Pentagon announced plans to send an additional $500 million worth of military aid to Ukraine. The development came as Ukraine's army enters the third week of a vaunted counteroffensive that CNN describes as, quote, not meeting expectations, and which even Volodymyr Zelensky says is going slower than desired. As Ukraine's military failed to breach Russia's primary defense line, CNN reported on June 12th that Kiev had lost, quote, lost 16 U.S.-made armored vehicles sent to the country. So what did the Pentagon do? It simply passed that bill down to average U.S. taxpayers like myself, charging us another $325 million to replace Ukraine's squandered military stock. There was zero effort to consult the U.S. public's position on the matter, and the vast majority of Americans likely did not even know the exchange took place. This policy that I'm describing to you, which sees Washington prioritize unrestrained funding for a proxy war with a nuclear power in a foreign land while our domestic infrastructure falls apart before our eyes, exposes a disturbing dynamic at the heart of the Ukraine conflict, an international Ponzi scheme that enables Western elites to seize hard-earned wealth from the hands of average U.S. citizens and funnel it into the coffers of a foreign government that even Transparency International ranks as consistently one of the most corrupt in Europe. The U.S. government has yet to conduct an official audit of its funding for Ukraine. The American public has no idea where their tax dollars are going. And that's why this week, we at the Gray Zone published an independent audit of U.S. tax dollar allocation to Ukraine throughout the fiscal years 2022 and 23. Our investigation was led by Heather Kaiser, a former military intelligence officer who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. We found, among many bizarre payments, a $4.5 million payment from the U.S. Social Security Administration to the Kiev government. We found $4.5 billion worth of payments from the U.S. Agency for International Development to pay off Ukraine's sovereign debt, much of which is owned by the global investment firm BlackRock. That amounts to $30 taken from every U.S. citizen at a time when 4 in 10 Americans cannot afford a $400 emergency. We found tax dollars earmarked for Ukraine, padding the budgets of a television station in Toronto, a pro-NATO think tank in Poland, and believe it or not, even rural farmers in Kenya. We found tens of millions to private equity firms, including one in the Republic of Georgia, as well as $1 million payment to a single private entrepreneur in Kiev. Our audit also revealed the Pentagon's $4.5 million contract with a company called Atlantic Diving Supply to provide Ukraine with unspecified explosives equipment. This is a notoriously corrupt company that none other than Tom Tillis, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, previously lambasted for its, quote, history of fraud. Yet once again, Congress has failed to ensure these shady payments and massive arms deals are properly tracked. In fact, much of the military and humanitarian aid shipped to Ukraine has simply vanished. Last year, CBS News quoted the director of a pro-Zelensky nonprofit in Ukraine who reported that only 30% of aid was reaching the front lines. The embezzlement of funds and supplies is at least as troubling as the potential consequences of the illicit transfer and sales of military-grade weapons. Last June, the head of Interpol warned that the massive transfers of arms into Ukraine means, quote, we can expect an influx of weapons in Europe and beyond, and that criminals are now, as we speak, focusing on them. This May, a group of anti-Kremlin Russian exiles outfitted with gear supplied by the Ukrainian government was hailed by Western politicians for carrying out terrorist attacks in Russian territory using American-made Humvees. Although the group, the so-called Russian Volunteer Corps, is led by a man who calls himself the, quote, White King, and includes numerous open admirers of Adolf Hitler, described as neo-Nazis in U.S. mainstream media, the Western weaponization of this militia against Russian forces and Russian civilians has not prompted any outcry from Congress. And while the Biden administration has promised that it's keeping tabs on the weapons sent, a State Department cable leaked last December conceded that, quote, kinetic activity and active combat between Ukrainian and Russian forces create an environment in which standard verification measures are sometimes impracticable or impossible. The Biden administration not only knows that it cannot track the weapons it's shipping to Ukraine, it knows that it is escalating a proxy war against the world's largest nuclear power and daring it to respond in kind. We know this because back in 2014, and this timeline is so important, that's when NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that the war started following a US-backed coup d'etat. President Barack Obama rejected demands from Kiev to send lethal offensive weaponry because, as the Wall Street Journal put it, he had a, quote, long-standing concern that arming Ukraine would provoke Moscow into further escalation that would drag Washington into a proxy war. When Donald Trump entered office in 2017, he attempted to hold the line on Barack Obama's policy, but was soon branded a Russian puppet by the Beltway press corps and the Democratic Party for refusing to send Raytheon's Javelin missiles to the Ukrainian military. His reluctance to send the Javelins became a central theme of his impeachment, and he predictably relented. As U.S.-made offensive weaponry began to reach the front lines of the Donbass, the collective West exploited the Minsk Accords to, quote, give Ukraine time to arm up, as the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel put it. In January 2022, the U.S. announced a $200 million arms package to Ukraine. Follow the timeline. By the 18th of February, observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe reported a doubling in ceasefire violations, with OSCE maps showing the overwhelming majority of targeted sites on the side of pro-Russian separatists in Donetsk and Lugansk. 5 days later, Russia invaded Ukraine. And since then, the U.S. and its allies have been scurrying up the escalation ladder at every opportunity. Quote, things we couldn't give in January because it was escalatory were given in February, a former State Department official complained after meeting with Ukrainian counterparts. And things we couldn't give in February, we can in April. That has been the distinct pattern, starting with, for crying out loud, Stingers, referring to shoulder-mounted rockets. Joe Biden himself said in March 2022, the idea that we're going to send in offensive equipment and have planes and tanks, don't kid yourself. No matter what you all say, that's called World War III. Just over a year later, Biden changed his tune, backing a plan to provide F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, and after pressuring Germany to send in the tanks he once feared would provoke World War III. It would only take 2 months from the time Ukraine received HIMARS, Lockheed-made HIMARS systems for the U.S. For the Ukrainian military to begin targeting critical infrastructure, using them to strike the Antonovsky Bridge over the Dnipro River, and again 2 months later in a test strike on the Kakhovka Dam to see if the Dnipro's water could be raised enough to stymie Russian crossings, as the Washington Post reported. 3 weeks ago, the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed, triggering a major environmental catastrophe that caused mass flooding and contamination of the local water supply. Ukraine, of course, blames Russia for this attack, but has produced no evidence. Around this time, Ukraine also baselessly accused Russia of planning a provocation at the Zaporiyia nuclear plant. This triggered a resolution by Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, no relation to me, calling for NATO to intervene directly in Ukraine and attack Russia if such an incident occurred. The move by Blumenthal and Graham thus established a de facto red line for initiating U.S. military action, much like the one set down in Syria, which, as a former U.S. diplomat commented to journalist Charles Glass, was an open invitation to a false flag. Will we see another Duma deception, but this time in Zaporiyia? This time with nuclear consequences? Why are we doing this? Why are we tempting nuclear annihilation by flooding Ukraine with advanced weapons and sabotaging negotiations at every turn? We've been told by people like Senator Dick Durbin that Ukraine is literally in a battle for freedom and democracy itself, and therefore anyone who opposes military aid to Ukraine opposes the very defense of democracy, according to this logic. So where's the democracy in Vladimir Zelensky's decision to ban opposition parties, to criminalize the media outlets of his legitimate political opponents, to jail his top political rival and his deputies, to raid Orthodox churches and jail clergymen? Where is the democracy in the Ukrainian government's imprisonment of Gonzalo Lira, an American citizen, simply for challenging the official narrative of Ukraine's war? And where is the democracy in Zelensky's recent decision to suspend elections in 2024 on the grounds that martial law has been declared? The answer is that Ukrainian democracy is harder to find these days than that country's commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny. Senator Lindsey Graham has offered a much more grim and more on-the-mark rationale for supplying Ukraine with billions in weapons. As the senator boasted during a recent visit with Zelensky in Kiev, the Russians are dying. It's the best money we've ever spent. I repeat, the Russians are dying. It's the best money we've ever spent. And Graham has also said that Americans are ready to fight this war down to the last Ukrainian. While official casualty numbers are strictly classified, we must worry that Ukraine is well on its way to fulfilling the senator's ghoulish fantasies. As a Ukrainian soldier complained this month to Vice News, we don't know what Zelensky's plans are, but, quote, it looks like the extermination of its own population, like of the combat-ready and working-age population. That's it. Indeed, military cemeteries in Ukraine are expanding almost as rapidly as the Northern Virginia McMansions and beachfront estates of executives from Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and assorted Beltway contractors benefiting from the second highest level of military spending since World War II. These are the real winners of the Ukraine proxy war, not average Ukrainians or Americans or Russians, the winners, or Europeans for that matter. The winners are people like Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who spent his time between the Obama and Biden administrations launching a consulting firm called West Exec Advisors, which secured lucrative government contracts for intelligence firms and the arms industry. Blinken's former partners at West Exec include Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, CIA Deputy Director David Cohen, former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, and almost a dozen current and former members of Biden's national security team. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, for his part, is a former and possibly future board member of Raytheon, and an ex-partner of Pine Island Capital Investment, which collaborates with West Exec and which Blinken himself has advised. Meanwhile, the current U.S. ambassador to this body, the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, is listed as a senior counsel at the Albright Stonebridge Group, a self-described commercial diplomacy firm that also finesses government contracts for the intelligence and arms sector, and which was founded by Madeleine Albright, infamously known for her comments that the deaths by sanctions of 500,000 Iraqi children were worth it. So while military-age Ukrainian men are ripped off the streets by military police and sent to the front lines, the financially and politically connected architects of this proxy war are planning to walk through the revolving door to reap unimaginable profits once their time in the Biden administration is over. For them, a negotiated settlement to this territorial dispute means an end to the cash cow of close to $150 billion in U.S. aid to Ukraine. So in closing, when the United States, my country, a permanent member of this council, has fallen under the control of a bipartisan regime which seeks to perpetuate a proxy war for as long as it takes, in the words of Joe Biden, which considers diplomacy synonymous with unilateral coercive measures to, quote, turn the ruble to rubble, as Biden pledged to do, whose leadership subverts negotiations in order to pursue profit while refusing to properly inform its own citizens what they're paying for, and pushes the sons and brothers of its supposed Ukrainian partners out onto a killing field in order to bludgeon a geopolitical rival, when both Zelensky and members of U.S. Congress are calling for preemptive strikes on Russia, which have nothing to do with Article 51 of the UN Charter, this Council must take action to enforce that charter. That charter is clear that the Security Council must use its authority to guarantee a pacific settlement of dispute, particularly when it threatens international security. That should not only apply to Russia and Ukraine. This Council has an obligation to strictly monitor and restrain the U.S. and the illegal military formation known as NATO. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Blumenthal for his briefing. I would like to remind the briefers to limit their interventions to 10 minutes. I now give the floor to Mr. Che Baus. Mr. Baus, we don't hear you.
Is that okay?
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Baus.
Sorry about that. Well, thank you for asking me to appear, ladies and gentlemen and chairman. And despite well over a year of frenzied and what is now recognized as loosely regulated supply of incalculable numbers of weapons to Ukraine, sources within the country still maintain that it needs an escalating volume of heavy and light weapons and ammunition to conduct its operations. And it's now glaringly apparent that what began as NATO supporting a Ukrainian military that it had built since the beginning of the civil war in the East in 2014 has now in real terms become a proxy conflict where Ukraine supplies manpower with ever diminishing operational capability to support a de facto NATO operation to prevent a Russian military victory in Ukraine, and thus avert the potentially terminal impact such a victory would have on the operational, political, and reputational survival of NATO itself. It's critical that the reality of this situation is seen for what it actually is. This is indeed the very real escalating concern of NATO planners and their political funders, particularly in the ever hawkish Anglosphere. And this geostrategic reality also, of course, drives the seemingly perpetual escalation of military aid to Ukraine. All of this is despite tens of billions of dollars of weapons in various states of operability already being delivered to a country which the US State Department has described as endemically corrupt and in many sectors of society essentially lawless. And this was as recent as 2019. And it's crucially important that we are clear as to the kind of country these vast amounts of weapons are being delivered into. And I'd like to quote directly from their report in 2019 entitled Country Reports on Human Rights Practices, Department of State, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labour. And this is a shocking report that maintains that unlawful and arbitrary killings and torture are widespread, as are the abuse of detainees by law enforcement personnel, harsh and life-threatening conditions in prisons and detention centres, arbitrary arrest and detention, substantial problems with the independence of the judiciary, restrictions on freedom of expression, the press, the internet, including violence against journalists, censorship, the blocking of websites, the control of the press is widespread. It goes on to cite serious concerns regarding government corruption and crimes involving violence or the threat of violence targeting persons with disabilities, ethnic minorities, which I presume includes the Russian-speaking minority in the east of the country, and the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex community. And it's into this cauldron that the Western powers are pouring incalculable volumes of weapons and munitions and money. On the front lines, meanwhile, the military progress for the now serially depleted Ukrainian military is undeniably strategically insignificant, particularly in the context of the long-vaunted and publicized counteroffensive, where all qualified and objective, independent and non-aligned analysts must agree Ukraine is failing to achieve even the necessary initial breakthroughs against well-prepared and well-resourced Russian lines of defense. It's very interesting to hear the paid expert contributors in Western media encouraging an almost perverse, stiff upper lip, look the other way attitude when faced with the undeniably brutal losses Ukraine has and is undeniably suffered. These young men dying in their thousands are, in my considered view, the most foremost victims of this perpetual escalation in military aid to Ukraine, as they attempt to advance in close order, in daylight, across minefields, into pre-zeroed artillery kill zones, often in 30-year-old second-rate NATO-supplied armoured personnel carriers, like the US M113, a lightly armoured steel box, first entering service in 1960 and a veteran of another US foreign policy disaster, the Vietnam War. These may be accompanied by a handful of German Leopard tanks, many of which are decades old and grossly unsuited to the Ukrainian steppe, or maybe by what are supposed to be mine-resistant vehicles, all of which have been shown now to be exceptionally vulnerable to Russian anti-tank warfare systems, attack helicopters, and the brutal reality of in-depth Russian minefields. All of this occurs with no meaningful air support, let alone air supremacy, which Russia commands with its in-depth air defense systems and a large fleet of modern multi-role fighters. The idea that these assaults, which are essentially amounting to suicidal full frontal attacks on in-depth prepared defenses, are allowed to continue is, in my view, deeply cynical and I would suggest sinister. No modern NATO military strategist or senior officer would suggest these maneuvers are anything but an inhumane ticket to tragedy when commanding their own troops. Yet, when it comes to these Ukrainian young men mounting these assaults, being decimated, they are silent. They accept the Ukrainian government's ban on reporting from the front lines on the vast losses in men and material that evoke scenes more familiar with the Somme or Passchendaele. As increasingly depleted Ukraine can indeed defeat Russia on the battlefield, this ideology is a delusion. In eastern and southern Ukraine, somehow reclaim Crimea and subsume an unwilling ethnic Russian population back into a chaotic and essentially failed state governed from Kiev. The quality of some of the equipment which the United States has urged its smaller NATO allies to donate to Ukraine is at best repairable and at worst outright lethal, not to the Russian defenders, but to the Ukrainian operators. Several of these incentive deals have been done to entice NATO countries to dump older vehicles into a desperate Ukraine on the promise of replacement with better or at least younger equipment. In one case, Germany replaced 40 BMP-1A1s, one of the oldest versions of this Soviet troop carrier, for the Greek army with 40 Marder infantry fighting vehicles through a Ringtausch program. The Soviet-era armor then being forwarded to Ukraine. The same type of deals have been widespread regarding the hasty requirement to feed Ukraine's Soviet-era artillery, such as the Grad MLRS system, with post-Soviet states in Eastern Europe offering hundreds of thousands of rounds of artillery and rockets to the country in return for replacement systems. Surely the morality of this is deeply questionable. Of course, there is one fiscal beneficiary, and that is, of course, the NATO military-industrial complex, of which the United States is by far the biggest player globally. A recent New York Times article has outlined how profiteering and incompetence has further complicated the chaotic landscape in Ukraine when it comes to the flood of heavy and light weapons into the country. According to it, and I quote, Ukraine has paid contractors hundreds of millions of dollars for weapons that have not been delivered. And in some of the much publicized arms donated by its allies have been so decrepit that they were deemed fit only to be cannibalized for spare parts or indeed scrapped. The Ukrainian government has revealed documents that show, as at the end of last year, Kiev had paid arms suppliers more than $800 million for contracts that went completely or partly unfulfilled. Two of the individuals involved in the purchasing of this equipment, according to the New York Times, said that as of early this spring, hundreds of millions of dollars had been paid, including to state-owned companies, for arms that never materialized. And according to Volodymyr Havrilov, a deputy defense minister, and I quote, "We did have cases where we paid money and we didn't receive any of the weapons." And I would like to point out again, some of these contracts are with state companies, according to the New York Times. And it's very important that we try to show the sheer scale and volume of weapons flooding into Ukraine since last year. The United States alone has committed well over $40 billion worth of military aid to the Kiev government. The EU and other states have also contributed tens of billions into what we know to be one of the least regulated states on earth when it comes to control of corruption and institutional accountability. In addition, Ukraine has spent billions of dollars of its own money on the private arms market, possibly the most difficult area to ascertain any kind of transparency in. It's worth recalling that over the 20-year period of the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, the U.S. Department of Defense paid various companies about $108 billion in contracts for work performed in the country, with 1/3 of those contracts spending remarkably going to undisclosed recipients, domestic and foreign businesses who are not uniquely identified in the publicly available contracting databases. This information is from a landmark piece of work done by the Watson Institute for International Affairs, Brown University in Rhode Island in the USA, in their cost of war research on the Afghan misadventure. These vast sums would suggest to the novice taxpayer that Ukraine is receiving high-tech supplies, but in a reflection of the poor quality of Western donations and the brutal battlefield attrition rate, as much as 30% of Kiev's arsenal is under repair at any given time. And that's according to a source reported again by the New York Times in a separate article. It also suggests that a recent delivery of 33 self-propelled howitzers donated by the Italian government were basically only good for scrap, and that the Italian Defense Ministry had stated that the vehicles had been decommissioned several years ago, many years ago, but the Ukraine had asked for them anyway to be overhauled and put into operation, given the urgent need for a means to face Russian aggression. In a Pentagon Inspector General's report released last May, also illustrates some of these serious issues. An American unit was supposed to ship 29 Humvees, a very small amount of equipment to Ukraine from a depot in Kuwait. The cost of this action bears no remote link to any sort of strategic imperative whatsoever. By the time it actually arrived in Poland, only 3 of the vehicles were actually battle-worthy. The tires were rotten on them all, and they had to be replaced at huge cost and basically choking up the whole supply chain. The same thing has happened with M777 howitzers, which were a much vaunted game changer in the long line of much vaunted game changers that were going to turn the tide of the war in Ukraine, according to the Western media. Instead, the M777 howitzer has become a sitting duck for Russian loitering munitions, and we have verifiable evidence that over 100 of these units have been destroyed in the field in Ukraine. And by the way, the Pentagon report also says that at least one of the M777 howitzers was in such a bad shape it would have killed the operators trying to use it. And that is in the inspector's report that was concluded in March 2022. Similarly, Britain's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace announcing the planned transfer of AS-90 howitzers in Ukraine to great fanfare. We stand with Ukraine. In fact, when we look into this transfer, we see that these howitzers were unserviceable in varying states of readiness, and they ended up being scrapped or used for spare parts. So the haphazard distribution now of small arms across the country is probably more disturbing, if not more so, in the context of the Ukrainian conflict. Long before the Russian military operation in Ukraine began last February, various reports were highlighting the dangers to civil society of the widespread distribution of small arms and ammunition across the country. Now, Max Blumenthal has referred to some of this. In February 2022, Ukrainian authorities remarkably began to distribute tens of thousands of assault weapons, rifles, grenades, and millions of rounds of ammunition to the general population. In one incident alone, 6 kilometers from the center of Kiev, thousands of weapons were distributed to anybody willing to carry them. Some 18,000 portable assault weapons, rifles, and pistols with ammunition were handed out to untrained civilians within days of the Russian intervention. This was confirmed by Ukraine's Interior Ministry advisor, Vadim Denitsko, to the BBC. It's impossible to imagine or even speculate as to the volume of illicit and official small arms now circulating in the country. A country, again, experiencing catastrophic levels of dysfunction and destruction, criminality and corruption. I don't need to cite the various Interpol reports. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu suggesting that there are Western anti-tank weapons now on the borders of Israel in the hands of the enemies of Israel. I won't quote those because they're widely and they've been mentioned by other briefers. But this leads to my next point, which I'm anxious to make regarding the potential destructive power of every single military-grade weapon in the wrong hands. The unthinkable destruction of a single anti-aircraft weapon could have on the periphery of any European airport. We've all seen the tragic consequences of the brutal terror attacks at the Bataclan Theatre in Paris in November 2015, where 130 innocent civilians died and 416 were injured. The attackers carried Zastava M70 assault rifles, which had been previously deactivated and reactivated for the attacks. The M70 is a Serbian copy of the Kalashnikov rifle, the most common weapon now circulating in the tens of hundreds of thousands in Ukraine. It's a lethal and capable weapon, easy to use, easy to conceal, and in the wrong hands, capable of delivering catastrophic destruction and firepower. Unfortunately, given the huge scale of the saturation of Ukrainian society with such weapons, it's absolutely inevitable that significant numbers of these weapons have and will continue to be sold on the black market to the highest bidders, particularly in a society racked by conflict, societal breakdown, and the ensuing lawlessness that brings. It doesn't take vast numbers of weapons to cause significant civil strife and lead to severe local and potentially national escalation of conflict. In my own country, British forces colluded with loyalist paramilitary gangs through the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s to terrorize and murder hundreds of innocent civilians over decades with relatively minuscule amounts of weaponry, actually less than hundreds of firearms. The Irish Republican Army was able to mount a serious threat to the British state itself with relatively small amounts of weapons and explosives. Thousands were killed and injured during a decades-long conflict sustained by a relatively small arsenal of weaponry. When the IRA decommissioned its arsenal, it was found to have only 1,000 rifles, 2 tons of Semtex explosive, and 7 surface-to-air missiles. Yet this was enough to mount a sustained and significant threat to the British state. As I've mentioned many times, more weapons were handed out over a period of days to civilians in Kiev in the context of the Ukrainian conflict than these numbers themselves. They're absolutely minuscule, but they demonstrate the potential for a relatively small armed group on either side to exert disproportionate influence in any post-conflict period, which could lead to the collapse of any accommodation or agreement. It is the proliferation of these weapons that potentially could lead to decades of instability, not only in other parts of Europe and further afield, but in Ukraine itself. Finally, and to wind up, I recently spent some time in the city of Belgorod, which has come under sustained attack from Ukrainian artillery and drones. I visited the town of Shebekino and a large displaced person centres the government is providing to tens of thousands of ordinary civilians that had to flee their homes due to the indiscriminate shelling of civilian targets. I've stood with an 83-year-old woman as she asked me what she had done to deserve a high explosive drone to target her home in a civilian terror block in Voronezh, a Ukrainian drone. I've seen those villages burning. I've heard the artillery strike, and I have to tell you that weapons being supplied by NATO and their allies to Ukraine are being willfully targeted against civilian populations on a daily basis in Donbass, Lugansk, Belgorod, all miraculously invisible to the Western media. It's incumbent on all here that have any influence to convey the reality of the conflict to their own people, to avoid the increasingly dangerous spiral of escalation that leads us further towards the absolutes at the expense of compromise. I owe it to the men and women and children who I've met in the conflict zones, who I have had the privilege to speak to convey the reality of increased militarization in the region. I urge you to seek accommodation and peace, to respect the democratic mandate of those who have expressed it. Settlement will come, and it's my absolute belief that it's up to those in Washington and London, now fueling the conflict with endless escalatory military aid to Ukraine, to decide where and when that settlement occurs, either at the negotiating table or on the battlefield. We have an expression in Ireland: he who pays the piper calls the tune. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Bose for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Sergei Radchenko.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Radchenko, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Mr. President, Excellencies, it is an honor to speak to the Council and to follow such loquacious presentations. Russia is conducting a war of aggression against Ukraine, a terrible war that has already cost many tens of thousands of lives. Russia has resorted to indiscriminate bombing of civilians. Its troops have committed atrocities, including torture, rapes, and killing. Russia has violated principles of the United Nations, which it helped craft at the end of the Second World War. Just yesterday, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov claimed in an interview that no one has ever sent him the list of rules for the rules-based international order. Mr. President, this list exists. It is called the Charter of the United Nations, and here's what it says, and I quote, "All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations." The UN Charter was signed on June 26, 1945, in the wake of the most destructive war the world has ever seen. A war of those who sought to enslave the world by conquest and brutality against those who stood up against aggression, who fought shoulder to shoulder for their freedom and dignity. In July 1937, After several years of gradual encroachment through creation of various puppet states, Imperial Japan invaded the Republic of China. The Japanese armies brutally fought their way across China. The Chinese government appealed for international help and received it. None other than Moscow provided China with hundreds of aircraft and even pilots who played a crucial role in the Chinese resistance effort, and in particular in the Battle of Wuhan in the spring of 1938. Were it not for Soviet and later American help, the aggressor would have triumphed and China would have fallen. After World War II broke out in Europe and German armies laid waste to neighboring countries, the United States stepped up to the task, both by committing its troops and also, crucially, by providing Lend-Lease aid to those countries fighting against Hitler's aggression, including the Soviet Union. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States provided the Soviet Union with $11 billion worth of aid, which is over $200 billion in today's dollars, an amount second only to that provided to the United Kingdom. This aid included over 14,000 airplanes, 12,000 armored vehicles, including 7,000 tanks, over 8,000 artillery pieces, including anti-aircraft weapons, over 400,000 jeeps and trucks, and 197 torpedo boats. Now, policymakers in Berlin may well have been concerned at the time that such an ambitious effort by the United States prolonged the war because it made it more difficult for Germany to defeat and enslave the Soviet Union. But it is worth reiterating that these supplies were the Soviet Union's lifeline. Without them, the Soviet Union would have most certainly been overrun by the Third Reich. The United Nations would never have won, and Mr. Max Blumenthal and Mr. Che Bois would never have joined us today to tell us about the heavy, very heavy, completely unacceptable burden of supporting freedom. Why are we doing this, Mr. Blumenthal asks rhetorically. I'll tell you, Mr. Blumenthal, so that you, Mr. Bois, can come here and tell us how terrible it is to support a victim of unprovoked aggression, how terrible it is to help people under attack, how terrible it is to resist imperialist conquest. Mr. President, I'm a historian, and historians bring the past to the present so that we gain a better understanding of what the future may hold. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not a historically unprecedented development. Wars of aggression happened before. Unprovoked invasions happened before. They tend to have consequences. One of their consequences is the tendency of the invaded party to resist the invader and to ask for outside assistance. We know that this idea was enshrined in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, one of those that no one has sadly showed to Sergei Lavrov, but one that speaks of, and I quote, the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense, end quote. It is by that inherent right that Ukraine has turned to the world with a plea for help. It is by that inherent right that so many nations have contributed to Ukraine's defense by sending much-needed military aid. If anything, they have not gone far enough, for Russia continues to occupy internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, posing a grave threat to international peace and security. The great Karl von Clausewitz, who incidentally served in the Russian army during the Napoleonic invasion of Russia, had once noted that the aggressor, and I quote, is always peace-loving. That is, he would like to invade his neighbors peacefully unless there's organized resistance. Господин председатель, Clausewitz был прав.
President, Clausewitz was right. Russian complaints regarding external support to Ukraine do not detract from the following facts. 1. The Russian Federation invaded Ukraine on trumped-up reasons, not the opposite. Second, the Russian Federation continues to violate international law, waging a war of aggression against a neighboring state. Third, the Russian Federation is continuing to bomb Ukrainian cities, including Kramatorsk just yesterday, where the Russian Federation destroyed civilian infrastructure, specifically a restaurant. As a result, innocent civilians perished. 3 children were in their ranks. Fourth, the Russian Federation has been so bold as to demand that the West does not supply Ukraine with weapons to defend itself against a treacherous attack. The next fact is that the Security Council can differentiate between truth and lies. It can differentiate between those who are truly peace-loving and those who are talking about striving for peace, but actually waging war. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Radchenko for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
President,
прежде всего хотели
at
бы
the outset,
поблагодарить госпожу Накамицу,
we should like to thank
господина
Ms.
Блюменталя и господина Боуза
Nakamitsu,
за
Mr. Blumenthal, and Mr. Bose
обстоятельные выступления,
for their
особенно
comprehensive
этих двух
statements,
бриферов.
specifically those from the
Господин
two
Радченко, я
briefers.
хочу сказать,
Mr.
давайте не
Radchenko,
будем лукавить,
to whom I'd like to say the following.
лукавить в отношении
Let's
Rule-Based
not
International
be
Order. Rules-Based
hypocritical
International
regarding
Order — это
the
совсем не
rules-based
устав.
international order.
А набор
The
придуманных
rules-based
узким кругом
international
стран,
order is
прежде
not the
всего
UN Charter.
западных правил,
It's a set of rules thought up by a small number of
потом ими за
countries, Western
универсальными.
countries, which are
И,
being
в принципе,
portrayed
нам не очень
as
понятно.
universal.
Если
So in
первые
principle,
два
we don't
брифера
quite
говорили по
understand,
теме, дали
whereas the two
много
briefers
полезных
spoke
деталей
to the topic at
про
hand,
поставки
gave us
оружия на
useful
Украину и
details
его
regarding
финансирование.
weapon supplies to
Господин
Ukraine,
Радченко
the way
дал
it's being
чисто
financed.
исторический экскурс.
Mr.
Нам
Radchenko
непонятен
took us
критерий его подбора.
on a historical lecture. He gave us a historical lecture, so we don't understand the reason for that.
Как мы только что услышали от
As we
наших
just
докладчиков,
heard from
не
our
от всех,
briefers,
правда, угрозы,
not all of them, of
порождаемые
course,
поставками
threats
западного
stemming
вооружения
from
на
Western
Украину
weapons being supplied to
продолжают
Ukraine
нарастать и
are continuing
множиться
to
на
grow
фоне
and multiply.
непрекращающихся
As
попыток
our
наших бывших
ex-Western
партнеров в
partners
очередной раз
continue to make
переложить на Россию
incessant
всю
attempts to
ответственность за
shift all
происходящее
blame
на
for
Украине.
what's going on in Ukraine onto
Нестыковки в
Russia.
раскручиваемом ими нарративе
Inconsistencies in the
очевидны.
narrative they're promoting
Страны
are
Запада
clear.
упорно пытаются
Western
заставить
countries are
международное
doggedly
сообщество
trying to make
забыть,
the
что
international
кризис
community
на Украине,
forget
как и
that the
поставки
crisis in
западных
Ukraine,
вооружений
just
Киеву,
like Western supplies to Kiev,
начались
began
задолго
long
до специальной
before
военной
the
операции.
special military
Сегодня,
operation.
благодаря откровениям
Today,
целого
thanks
ряда
to revelations from a whole
высокопоставленных
host of
политиков того
high-ranking
времени, мы
politicians
знаем, что
at the
планомерная
time, we
накачка
know
Украины оружием
that the
и
planned
ее
pumping
подготовка
of
к войне с
Ukraine
Россией все эти
full
годы
of weapons
велась за
and
ширмой
work to prepare
Минских
it for
соглашений,
war with Russia was
выполнять
going on
которые,
all these
несмотря
years,
на то, что они
concealed by the
закреплены
Minsk
соответствующими
Accords, despite the
резолюциями
fact that
Совета
these accords were backed up
Безопасности,
by
ни западные
concomitant
страны,
UN
ни
Security
сам
Council
Киев не собирались.
resolutions, although
Тем
neither
временем
the Western
мирное
countries nor
население Донбасса
Kiev ever
подвергалось
intended to
массированным
implement
ударам.
them. All the
Россия,
while,
естественно,
civilians
не
in the
могла
Donbass were
безучастно
subjected to
следить
mass
за этим.
shelling. Russia, of course, could not remain
Сейчас
indifferent.
же, однако, западные кураторы киевского режима
Today,
пытаются представить
Kiev's
дело
Western
таким образом,
patrons are
что
trying to put a
вооружать
new spin
Украину они
on the
начали
state of
лишь
affairs,
с
saying
началом
that they only
специальной
began to
военной
arm
операции
Ukraine
для
when the special
отражения
military
российской
operation
агрессии.
began in order to repel
Эта
so-called
схема за
Russian
1,5
aggression.
года
This
превратилась в
scheme over the last
нечто
18 months,
вроде
it's
частной
become to
военной
something
кампании
akin
Украины.
to a private military company
Натовцы
entitled Ukraine.
поставляют оружие,
NATO
в
supplies
основном
weapons,
утилизируя свои старые
mainly
запасы,
using their old
финансируют под
stockpiles,
шумок свои военные корпорации,
financing their
получающие
military
баснословные
companies on
прибыли,
the sly. These
а
companies are
воюют
making
и
exorbitant
десятками
profits,
тысяч
whereas
погибают на поле
the ones
боя
fighting
украинцы.
and dying by the tens of thousands in the
Сегодня уже
battlefield are
говорилось нашим
Ukrainians.
бриферам, что
Our
сенатор
briefers
Линдси
already
Грэм в ходе
mentioned
встречи
that
с главой
Senator Lindsey
киевского
Graham,
режима
when he met with the
назвал
head
эту
of the Kiev
схему и
regime,
гибель в результате
called the scheme
россиян
and the resulting
самой
deaths
удачной
of
тратой
Russians
денег
the
США в
best
рамках
money
помощи
the US
Украине.
has ever spent in its efforts to
На
help
сегодня
Ukraine.
совокупный объем
Today,
военной
the
помощи
cumulative
США
amount
и
of
их
military
подсоюзников Украине
assistance
превысил
the
55
US
миллиардов
and
долларов.
its allies have provided to
И тот
Ukraine
факт, что
is over
поставляемое вооружение
$55
используется
billion.
для обстрелов
The
гражданских
fact that
объектов
these weapons
и
are being
приводит к
used to
гибели
shell
мирных
civilian
жителей,
infrastructure and are resulting in
чему
civilian
есть
deaths,
многочисленные
and there is a great
доказательства,
deal of evidence, in
западных
fact,
миролюбцев
to
не
back that
смущает.
up. Well, the West
Страны
is
коллективного
unruffled by
Запада
this,
сейчас
the so-called
осуществляют не
peace-loving
только
West.
безудержную накачку
The
киевского
West
режима
is not
оружия, но и
only
обучение
pumping the Kiev
вооруженных
regime
сил
full of
Украины
weapons
и
in an unbridled
националистических
fashion,
батальонов
it's
на
also
своих
training
территориях,
Ukrainian armed forces and
предоставляют
nationalist battalions
украинской
on
армии
their own
разведданные
territory.
для целей
They're
указания
providing
и даже
intelligence to the Ukrainian
санкционирования
army for
ударов по
target
конкретным
setting.
целям
They're even
западным
approving
оружием.
strikes conducted
При этом
using
старательно
Western
утверждается,
weapons.
что в конфликте
And
с
yet
Россией
they're
западные
assiduously
страны не
asserting
участвуют.
that the West is
То есть
not involved
получается,
in
что
this
они как бы
conflict.
нейтральны.
Supposedly, they're
Однако
neutral.
международное право,
And yet,
включая
international
положение
law,
Гаагской
including the
конвенции
provisions of the
1907
Hague
года и
Convention
нормы
stated in
международного
1907 and the
обычного
norms of
права,
customary
недвусмысленно
international law
запрещают
are
нейтральным
unequivocal. They
государствам
prohibit
любые
such
подобные
action
действия.
by neutral
Их
states.
совершение приводит к
Commission
утрате
of such
нейтрального
acts
статуса
mean
и
that these
превращает
states will lose
государство
their
в
neutral
сторону
status
вооруженного конфликта.
and will become parties to an armed
Пытаясь
conflict.
оправдаться, наши бывшие
As
партнеры
justification,
приводят
our former
аргумент о том,
partners
что
are putting forward
Гаагские
the
конвенции
following argument. They
1907
say
года
that the
якобы
1907 Hague
безнадежно
Convention
устарели.
is supposedly supposedly
Странно
terribly
это слышать
outdated.
от
It's very
государств,
strange to
военные
hear that
ведомства,
from
которые
states, military
регулярно
agencies of which
обновляют
are
и
regularly
переиздают
updating and
огромные
reissuing
фолианты,
heavy tomes
посвященные законам и
dedicated
обычаю
to the
войны.
laws and customs of war.
Там есть и солидный
These
раздел о
tomes
правах и
include lengthy sections
обязательствах нейтральных
about
государств,
the
инкорпорирующих в
rights and
том
duties
числе
of
нормы
neutral
этих
states,
якобы устаревших
including
конвенций.
including the norms of these supposedly outdated conventions. Let me underscore, these are not publications containing doctrine. These documents are practical guidelines for army and flotilla commanders, which call for the harshest measures to be taken in response to neutrality being violated, including the use of force.
Конвенции 1907 года – это действующие международные договоры, которые никто не отменял.
International agreements which are in force. They have not been abrogated. Their main objective is to prevent the spread of armed conflict, to prevent a growing number of states being pulled into such conflicts. Today, these conventions are more relevant than ever. After all, the collective West has proclaimed that its objective is to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia in the battlefield. Their madcap statements are accompanied with irresponsible actions. We're tempted to call this playing with fire, but it's actually worse than that. In their militaristic frenzy, having become completely untethered from reality, the West is deliberately provoking a direct confrontation between nuclear powers. Another argument is based on branding our country as the aggressor, referring to the resolution adopted at the 11th Extraordinary Special Session of the UNGA. The US has started a record number of aggressive wars throughout its history, and yet they're proclaiming that you can help the so-called victim of the aggression without losing your neutral status. Any self-respecting international lawyer will find such arguments laughable. And it's not to do with the fact that the support from the West to these non-consensus documents, which are actually recommendations, vanish into thin air as soon as you become well-versed in the real reasons of the Ukrainian crisis. It's not the fact that the US and its satellites are the architects and main beneficiaries of the situation. In fact, the main problem is that the UN General Assembly is in principle not empowered, pursuant to the UN Charter, to determine that an aggression has occurred. Such qualifications are in violation of the provisions of the Charter and are nugatory ab initio.
Получается, что ярлык агрессора никакая не юридическая
aggressor
квалификация,
is not
а
a
политическая
legal
оценочная
qualification.
категория.
It's in fact a
Без
political
правового
assessment.
фундамента вся
Without any
возведенная
legal
на нем
foundation,
конструкция
everything that's
квалифицированного
been built
нейтралитета
on
рассыпается.
this argument, so-called
Ну
qualified
а уж если мы
neutrality,
переходим к
all that
оценочным
crumbles.
категориям, то
And
агрессор
if
тут
we
скорее
are
тот,
talking
кто
about
организовал кровавый профашистский
value judgment
переворот в
assessments, the
соседнем с
aggressor
нами
is the
государстве
one
всеми
who
силами
organized a
и
bloody
средствами лепил
pro-fascist
из него
coup in a neighboring
образование
country
враждебной России и всему
and
русскому.
turned the resulting
Истории,
state
культуре,
in an
языку и
enemy of
даже
Russia
православной
and an
вере.
enemy of everything
Тот,
that's
кто
Russian.
обучал
History,
боевиков,
culture, language,
включая
and even the
грозные
Orthodox
националистические
faith. The one
батальоны и снабжал их оружием
trained
задолго до февраля
fighters, including
2022 года.
vile
Прекрасно
neo-Nazi
понимая, что это
battalions,
оружие
supplied them with weapons
используется
long
для
before
убийства
February of
мирных жителей
2022,
Донбасса.
knowing that these weapons
Да и
were
подача
going to
НАТО
be used
куда так
against
стремится попасть
peace-loving
Украине
civilians in the
в
Donbass.
качестве сугубо оборонительного союза
Also,
звучит
NATO
как
is trying to portray
неудачная
itself
шутка на фоне обширного
as a
послужного
strictly
списка неспровоцированных и
a body that
необоснованных
exists
военных
strictly for
агрессий с
self-defense. It
участием
sounds like a
этого
bad joke, given
милитаристского
the lengthy track record of unprovoked
Не
and
выдерживают никакой
unjust
критики и
military
рассуждения
aggressions
западной
with the
юридической
involvement of
доктрине о
NATO.
якобы
What also doesn't hold
коллективной
water
самообороне по
is
статье
the
51.
Western legal
И здесь два
doctrine,
основных вопроса.
according to which
Мы что-то не видели
collective
уведомления об
self-defense is
этом
being
в
invoked
Совете,
under Article
которое,
51.
согласно
There are two
уставу
key questions here.
ООН, должно
We didn't
направляться
receive a
незамедлительно.
notification here at the Security
К тому
Council,
же
according to which
заявление
the
о
Charter,
самообороне против России
according to the Charter,
было
such a
бы
notification
равнозначно
should be
констатации
immediate.
состояния войны с нашей
Thus, it would
стороны.
mean that if you are engaging in
Еще
self-defense, well, that
интереснее
would be
ссылка на
equivalent to
якобы
acknowledging that you are
контрмеры
at
по
war with
международному
our
праву.
country. What's more
Они,
interesting
как известно, должны
are references
удовлетворять
to
критерию
countermeasures under
соразмерности.
international law. As you
Какой
know,
же
these should
такой
be
ущерб Россия
commensurate.
нанесла
What
Соединенным
sort
Штатам
of
или странам
damage did
ЕС,
Russia do to the
который бы
US and
объяснял
to the
убийство из
EU to
западного оружия наших
justify
граждан
the
или
death of our
диверсии на
citizens
газопроводах «Северный
at the
поток-1»
hands
и
of
2
Western
или
weapons
террористические
and the
атаки на видных
sabotage Nord
общественных
Stream
объектов?
1, Nord Stream 2, or
В
the
общем,
terrorist
пока не
attacks
поздно
against prominent
рекомендуем
public
авторам
persons in the Russian
подобных
Federation.
умозрительных построений задуматься о
We
главном
suggest
вопросе.
that the authors of
Какими
these
в этом случае
speculative
должны быть российские
constructs to
ответные
ask
контрмеры?
themselves, what should Russia's response to
Господин
these
председатель, сегодня наши
countermeasures
бывшие
be?
партнеры в Совете Безопасности
President,
наверняка
today
вновь
our
станут
former
говорить о
partners here
своей
at the Security Council
приверженности
are likely going
урегулированию
to talk about
кризиса
how
на
they're
Украине.
committed to
Однако
settling the crisis
продвигаемый
in
западными
Ukraine,
странами
and yet the
нарратив
Western
упорно не
countries are
вписывается в
promoting a
тот
narrative which cannot be
что еще
squared with the
весной
fact
прошлого
that back
года
in
в
the spring of
Стамбуле
last year in
руководителем
Istanbul,
переговорной группы от
heads
Украины
of the
был
Ukrainian
парафирован
negotiating
проект мирного
delegation
договора.
actually initialed a peace agreement.
Его публично
This document was publicly demonstrated by the President of the Russian Federation at a recent meeting with African leaders. After the Kiev regime, under pressure from its Western sponsors, went back on these agreements and also introduced a legislative ban on peace talks with Russia. It became clear that a lasting, sustainable peace in our region is not in the interests of Western states. Well, where does that leave us? Agreeing with Russia on peaceful coexistence, becoming neutral, a state which doesn't threaten anybody, an non-aligned state. Well, the Western states didn't allow Ukraine to do that in March of last year. On the contrary, they're arming this country in an insane calculation that it's going to vanquish Russia. Western technology that's been supplied to Kiev is perishing on the battlefield, and in fact, Ukraine has almost run out of Ukrainian and other Soviet equipment. For instance, today, the Prime Minister of Latvia, just before our meeting, said, and here I quote, Ukraine has already been integrated into NATO as far as weapons are concerned, and we cannot but agree, because Ukraine can only fight using the weapons being supplied by the West and by NATO. It has hardly any other weaponry. The head of European diplomacy, Mr. Borrell,
the beacon of European diplomacy.
The beacon of European diplomacy, today stated that the EU is considering the possibility of turning the European Peace Fund into a Ukrainian defense fund.
Мы бы посоветовали господину Борреллю, как делали это уже раньше, не ограничиваться полумерами и промежуточными решениями, а сразу переименовать Европейский фонд мира в Европейский фонд войны. Собственных вооружений Украины не осталось, зато пока еще остались украинцы, которые как стадо гонят на убой в рамках так называемого контрнаступления ВСУ, называемого украинцами не иначе, как Запорожским СРУ. Мобилизационный резерв киевского режима еще не закончился, хотя все к этому идет. Но это чрезвычайно печально. Мест на украинских кладбищах уже не хватает.
They're running out of
И
space
вся эта
at
никому, кроме
Ukrainian
стран Запада,
cemeteries.
ненужная резня
And this bloodshed, the only people who want it is the West. It was imposed on Ukraine for one reason, so that there can be at least something that they can talk about, some success to report at the upcoming NATO summit in mid-July. There, Western governments will be able to assert that the huge sums being spent in Ukraine are not being spent for nothing. And more weapons will be sent to Ukraine, which again will be destroyed on the battlefield, like the weapons the UAF has right now. The balance of power will not be altered by these supplies, as most independent military experts have already acknowledged publicly that Kiev's defeat is a question of time. And a question of time, of course, is also the number of victims of the hands of the Ukrainian armed forces, which will be sacrificed in vain. Western propaganda peddlers are continuing to promote senseless and empty slogans, saying that Ukraine can win, although they couldn't care less.
Разумеется, в загашнике наших оппонентов остаются резонансные постановочные теракты, которые пытаются повесить на Россию, вроде Бучи или разрушения плотины Каховской ГЭС.
Terrorist attacks, trying to
Не
pin
дай бог
the
они решатся
pinnacle blame on
спровоцировать
Russia,
аварию
such as Bucha
на
and the
обстреливаемой
Kafka
украинцами
gas
Запорожской атомной
situation.
электростанции, от чего
God
погибнет
forbid a
и
disaster
пострадает
is
очень много
provoked
людей
at
по всей
the
Европе.
Zaporiyia NPP,
Сегодня
which
мы
would result in
распространили в
great
качестве
suffering
документа
and the loss
Совета
of many
Безопасности
lives.
Генеральной Ассамблеи ООН
Today,
письмо,
we disseminated
еще
a
раз
letter as a UN
подтверждание, на
Security
фоне
Council
продолжающихся
document,
безумных
which
инсинуаций
once again
представителей
confirms
киевского
that against the
режима,
backdrop
что
of
намерение
the
взорвать
insane
эту
insinuations of the
находящуюся
Kiev
под нашим
regime,
контролем
we
станцию
do
у
not
нас нет,
intend to blow up
и
this
призывающий
NPP. We have no
генерального
intention
секретаря
of
ООН и
doing so.
международное сообщество
In
повлиять
our
на
letter, we
Киев,
call on the UN Secretary
заставить его
General and the international
воздержаться от
community
провокаций в
to
отношении
influence
ЗАЭС.
Kiev, compelling it to
Вот
abstain
так
from
примерно выглядит
provocations at the
сегодняшняя
Zaporiyia
ситуация.
NPP.
Теперь,
So
после
that's
того,
the
как
situation
шанс
we
на
have in
мир
our
по вине
hands.
США
Now
и
that
ЕС
the opportunity
был
for
упущен в
peace
марте
was
прошлого
squandered
года,
back
его
of March,
условия для Украины,
in March of last
разумеется,
year.
будут уже другими.
Well, the conditions of
Закончить
peace
свое
for
выступление
Ukraine
я
will, of
хочу
course, be
цитатой
quite
одного
different.
очень
By way
уважаемого
of conclusion,
и
I'd like to quote
многоопытного
one
европейского
well-respected,
лидера.
highly experienced
На прошлой
European
неделе
leader.
он сказал
Last year,
буквально
he
следующее.
said basically the following.
Украина больше не является
Ukraine is no
суверенной
longer a sovereign
страной. У
country.
них нет
They
денег,
have
нет
neither money
оружия.
nor weapons.
Они могут
They can
воевать только
only
потому,
fight
что мы на Западе
because
их
we
поддерживаем.
in the West are supporting them.
Конец цитаты.
End of quote.
Единственная же
The
возможность
only
спасти
opportunity
Украину,
to
этот
save
политик
Ukraine,
видит так,
well, this politician sees
цитата,
it as the following, and
американцы
here I
должны
quote.
начать переговоры с
The
русскими,
Americans must
чтобы
begin
заключить
negotiations with the
соглашение
Russians so as
об
to sign an
архитектуре
agreement on a
безопасности,
security
где было бы место
architecture
для
which would
Украины.
include
Конец
space
цитаты.
for Ukraine. End of quote.
Комментировать тут особо
There's
нечего,
not much
хорошо, что
I
горькая
can say to
правда
that.
стала
The
доходить и
good
до
thing
западных
is that
лидеров.
the bitter truth is finally percolating, reaching Western leaders. Ongoing deliveries of Western weapons will not result in the outcome the West wants: to vanquish Russia on the battlefield, inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. We hope our Western colleagues will realize this as soon as possible. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie la haute représentante aux affaires de désarmement, Madame Izumi Nakamitsu, pour son intervention. Nous avons également pris note des autres présentations. Je me concentrerai aujourd'hui sur 3 points principaux. Premièrement, la Suisse condamne fermement l'agression militaire de la Russie contre l'Ukraine. Nous rejetons toute tentative de justifier et de déformer la responsabilité de cet acte ainsi que ses conséquences. Par celui-ci, la Russie viole gravement le droit international, notamment l'interdiction du recours à la force inscrite dans l'article 2 de la Charte des Nations Unies. L'Ukraine a le droit d'assurer sa sécurité et de défendre son intégrité territoriale et sa souveraineté. Deuxièmement, plusieurs résolutions de ce Conseil interdisent la livraison d'armes en provenance de certains pays. De telles livraisons, ainsi que l'utilisation de ces armes pour des attaques ciblées contre les infrastructures civiles, constituent des violations multiples du droit international. Nous appelons tous les États à respecter leurs obligations, y compris les résolutions pertinentes du Conseil de sécurité. Nous regrettons le lourd tribut payé par la population civile dans cette guerre. La Suisse appelle au strict respect
Switzerland calls for strict compliance with international humanitarian law. In the conduct of hostilities, the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution must be respected. We condemn any attack carried out in violation of these principles, and we reaffirm that those responsible for such acts must be brought to justice, and that victims must receive the necessary support for their physical, mental, social, and economic rehabilitation.
Troisièmement, avec la résolution ES 11-6 de l'Assemblée générale,
with General Assembly Resolution ES 11/6, we have a broadly supported basis for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter. We welcome diplomatic efforts that are being pursued in line with these principles. President, this war is causing immense suffering for the civilian population in Ukraine and is increasing instability throughout the world with unforeseeable consequences, including in Russia. We reiterate our concern about the intention to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus. In order that a diplomatic solution can be pursued, we call on Russia once again to de-escalate the situation, cease all combat operations, and withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory without delay. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, President. At the outset, I wish to thank Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Madam Izumi Nakamitsu, for her informative briefing. We have also taken note of the other briefings. President, it has now been 491 days since the Russian Federation launched its brutal and unrelenting war against Ukraine, bringing about untold suffering to innocent civilians who now live under constant threat of harm to their lives. Apart from the immediate humanitarian crisis, the war has become an axis of renewed geopolitical tensions with far-reaching implications for peace and security in the region of Europe. Away from the battle zone, the war continues to negatively impact the global economy with a persisting rise in food and energy prices and the tightening of international financial and monetary conditions. As confirmed in the briefing to the Council last week, the war now accounts for the displacement of some 10 million people and more than 24,000 civilian casualties. As the Council is often reminded, these numbers are likely to be higher as they represent only those reported through official United Nations sources. There is no scarcity of evidence of the mass destruction that has been caused in many parts of the country. Homes, schools, medical facilities, transport, energy, and other critical infrastructure are being destroyed at an alarming rate and in clear violation of the prohibitions against such actions under international humanitarian law. Presently, rescue efforts are continuing at the site of a missile strike on the restaurant in the city of Kramatorsk, where several people, including children, are reported to have been injured or dead. President, as we know, violent conflicts such as the one pertaining in Ukraine create the conditions for the accumulation of weapons and their diversion from government control to unintended recipients and conflict situations in other parts of the world. It is in this regard that my delegation has, in previous discussions on this subject, urged strict compliance with the Arms Trade Treaty and other international obligations designed to prevent the diversion or illicit transfer of conventional weapons. It is important that in maintaining international peace and security, member states providing defense assistance to Ukraine should implement arms control measures at all stages of weapons transfer, including risk assessment, maintaining records, monitoring and tracking, as well as post-conflict arrangements for disarmament. These measures are necessary to ensure that military support provided in the course of the war serve the singular purpose of strengthening Ukraine's capacity to assert its right to self-defense in accordance with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. President, from the very onset of the war, Ghana has struggled to appreciate the different assertions provided by the Russian Federation as justifications for its conduct in Ukraine. We also cannot reconcile with any suggestions that efforts in support of Ukraine's legitimate use of force in the defense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity constitute an obstruction to peace efforts. The rules of international law and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations require states to interact on the basis of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and cooperation. All member states, and more particularly the members of the Security Council, have an obligation to respect and uphold the fundamental principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity, which govern interstate relations and provide the foundations for a stable international order. It is on this basis that Ghana continues to call for the cessation of hostilities and urges the Russian Federation to end the war by the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of its troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. We also reiterate the absolute necessity for all parties to refrain from targeting civilians and causing further harm to Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. A large number of United Nations member states, including the members of this council, have taken a stand for peace in Ukraine and repeatedly called for a peaceful settlement in line with international law and the core values on which our organization is founded. Much responsibility now lies with the parties to extend themselves beyond their differences and return to the negotiating table in search of a comprehensive and lasting solution. In a postmodern and globalized world, where challenges that confront nations transcend physical and political boundaries, a purely inward-looking approach to security, which appears to be the case, may offer some temporary resolutions, but is unsustainable for the wider maintenance of our collective global security. We therefore encourage the intensification of diplomatic efforts in support of a constructive dialogue that could lead to a durable settlement between the two sides and in the interest of all others. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Thank you, President. And I thank Under-Secretary General Nakamitsu and Dr. Radchenko for their briefings. I'd like to make 3 points. First, the UK government has been clear about the military support that we have provided for the defense of Ukraine. The bravery and endless determination of Ukrainians is their own, but we're proud to support them in their fight to be free. And we're not just providing weapons. Around 17,000 Ukrainian soldiers have received training in the UK since the start of Russia's invasion. And we will also support Ukraine when peace is won, to rebuild their country, as we did at the Ukraine Recovery Conference last week, where the international community made over $60 billion worth of commitments. Colleagues, Ukraine continues to need our support. For them, this is a war of survival. For Russia, it is a war of choice. So second, let's remind ourselves how Russia has decided to fight its war of choice. Shelling civilian homes, human wave attacks ordered forward at gunpoint, atrocities left in the wake of its retreating forces, hundreds of civilians arbitrarily detained, over 90% of them reporting torture or ill treatment by Russian captors. On Tuesday, Russian missiles struck a pizza restaurant in Kramatorsk, taking 10 more innocent lives. Among those killed in the attack were two twin sisters, Yulia and Anna Aksenchenko. They were just 14 years old. This week, the Secretary-General published his report on children affected by armed conflict. Russia is part of its working group and knows that this reporting system is among the most rigorous used by the UN. The report is shocking. A permanent member of this council, listed alongside terror groups such as Al-Shabaab and Islamic State, for committing grave violations affecting children in situations of armed conflict. Russian forces have been responsible for killings, abductions, rapes of children as young as 4. 90 times, Russian forces used children as human shields. Every Russian should feel shame at what their army has done in Ukraine. But the Russian army doesn't fight alone. Putin has poured tanks, rockets, anti-aircraft missiles, and every kind of weaponry into the hands of unaccountable mercenary forces, recruited from the ranks of gangsters and convicts. A year ago, Russia denied the Wagner Group's existence. Now, Yevgeny Prigozhin's rebellion has publicly destroyed Putin's case for the war in Ukraine. And Wagner's march to Moscow showed us just how quickly Russians can leave Ukraine when they choose to. Third, without doubt, diplomatic efforts will be essential to peace, and we note the various ongoing efforts towards peace, including the African leaders' recent visit to Kyiv and Moscow this month. The UK fully supports President Zelensky's 10-point peace plan. The only path to sustainable peace is for Putin to withdraw his troops and end the bloodshed now. We will continue to stand with the people of Ukraine as they win a just and sustained peace that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in line with the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Nakamitsu for her briefing. I also thank the other briefers for their interventions. Brazil shares the concern about the disruptive potential of arms transfer to conflict zones. Our principal position on the subject remains the same. First, we recognize the inherent right of Ukraine and all member states to self-defense. This principle does not exempt us from the obligation enshrined in Article 33 to seek a peaceful solution to disputes through direct negotiations, conciliation, mediation, and any other means that do not involve resorts to arms. Moreover, we have consistently asserted the availability of arms and ammunition may become a long-term destabilizing factor and multiply threats to the security of civilian populations. In this regard, we must recognize the concrete risk of diversion of military equipment to non-state actors, including criminal and terrorist groups. Also, we believe that the Arms Trade Treaty provides the means to curtail illegal transfers and to prevent diversion. It is essential to preserve accurate records and ensure the transparency of transactions. We encourage other member states to take into consideration the provisions of the ATT when proceeding with their arms transfers. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie Madame Nakamitsu pour sa présentation. La Russie porte seule la responsabilité de cette situation. C'est elle qui a décidé, en violation de toutes les normes du droit international et au nom d'une tentative grossière de réécriture de l'histoire, d'agresser un pays souverain voisin. Nul autre qu'elle ne cherche à entretenir la guerre contre l'Ukraine. Elle peut y mettre un terme à tout moment en retirant ses troupes, comme la Cour internationale de justice l'a exigé il y a déjà plus d'un an. Contrairement à ce que la Russie affirme, l'Ukraine n'a jamais représenté une menace ni pour l'intégrité territoriale de la Russie, ni pour les populations russophones d'Ukraine. Notre position est constante. L'agression menée par la Russie ne doit pas et ne sera pas récompensée, car elle bafoue les principes des Nations Unies, car elle banalise le recours à la force, car elle augure d'un monde où la souveraineté des États ne dépendrait plus que des rapports de force. Monsieur le Président, l'Ukraine n'a pas voulu la guerre et n'a rien fait pour la provoquer. Celle-ci menace la sécurité de l'ensemble du continent européen. C'est pourquoi la France, avec ses partenaires, a fait le choix de soutenir résolument le peuple ukrainien dans son droit légitime à la défense de sa souveraineté et de l'intégrité territoriale, deux principes qui sont au cœur de notre charte. Nous continuerons de le faire à titre bilatéral et via l'Union européenne tant que des soldats russes se trouveront illégalement sur le territoire de l'Ukraine. En concentrant nos efforts sur les capacités antiaériennes, nous aidons le peuple ukrainien à se défendre face aux frappes russes contre les infrastructures civiles. Avant-hier encore, la Russie a visé un restaurant à Kramatorsk avec une frappe de missile qui a fait au moins 11 morts et 61 blessés. Ces frappes systématiques contre les infrastructures civiles sont constitutives de crimes de guerre. Ces dernières semaines, nous avons intensifié les livraisons d'armes et de munitions, de véhicules blindés, de soutien logistique et nos actions de formation. En appuyant la contre-offensive ukrainienne, nous souhaitons mettre l'Ukraine en position de force pour créer les conditions de la tenue de négociations crédibles, débouchant sur une paix juste et durable. Monsieur le Président, pour masquer ses responsabilités, la Russie cherche à détourner l'attention en s'appuyant sur les analyses des soi-disant experts que nous avons entendus aujourd'hui. Mais pour soutenir son agression, elle se procure des drones de combat iraniens qu'elle lance contre les infrastructures civiles. Elle achète en secret des missiles et des munitions à la Corée du Nord et elle fait tout cela en violation des résolutions du Conseil de sécurité. Certaines de ces armes sont utilisées sur le terrain par des milices financées par l'État russe. La Russie commence aujourd'hui à mesurer le coût de ce choix pour elle-même. Elle est atteinte par l'instabilité qu'elle a elle-même causée. Monsieur le Président, cette agression a des répercussions catastrophiques pour l'Ukraine et pour le monde entier. Mais elle est aussi une impasse pour la Russie qui doit réaliser que notre soutien à l'Ukraine ne faiblira pas et qu'il n'y a qu'une seule issue possible, une paix conforme à la Charte des Nations Unies qui respecte la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie la haute représentante Nakamitsu pour son édifiant. Nous avons écouté avec attention M. Blumenthal, M. Bowes et M. Radchenko. Monsieur le Président, après 16 mois de guerre,
After 16 months of war, Ukraine remains plunged into an unprecedented spiral of violence. The war is begetting terrible human suffering and a humanitarian situation with devastating consequences. Added to this, we have seen food and energy crises, which further make prospects for peace even more remote. The latest report of the UN High Commissioner details 24,862 civilian victims, 1,000 attacks on health infrastructure, and 260 cultural sites damaged, according to UNESCO. Announced offensives and counter-offensives on both sides point to the true toll in terms of the loss of human lives and mass displacements being even higher. President, the repeated attacks by the warring parties on the Zaporiyia nuclear power plant leave open the risk of a nuclear catastrophe, and we're still waiting to see the consequences of the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, which is a source of environmental, human and economic insecurity. My country condemns the use of all sorts of weapons with indiscriminate effects targeting populations and civilian infrastructure, including remote-controlled weapons inflicting needless suffering on people and contributing to fueling the climate of terror. My country reiterates its support to the Director General of the IAEA, and we invite the parties to respect the 5 principles guaranteeing nuclear safety and security. We stand opposed to all politicization and normalization of the nuclear issue. Nuclear power plants are civilian infrastructure protected under international humanitarian law. Diplomacy must prevail over strength and weapons proliferation, which only serves to worsen the conflict. President, my country calls on the warring parties to permit safe, unhindered access for humanitarian aid to all areas where there is a need. In conclusion, we reiterate our call for de-escalation and the launch of good faith negotiations to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I also thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her briefing and know the contributions made by the other briefers. Today's meeting was requested by the Russian Federation to condemn the increasing supply of weapons to Ukraine. This is the 6th time the Council is convening on this issue in an attempt to deviate the focus from the appalling acts and violations of international humanitarian law Russian forces are perpetrating in Ukraine. As observed by other Council members, these meetings serve one purpose only: for Russia to cynically try to justify its unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. Despite these distractions, we must not lose sight of the reality on the ground. The reality is that on 24 February 2022, the Russian Federation, a permanent member of this Council that is entrusted with safeguarding international peace and security, decided to invade its neighbors. It was Russia's decision to illegally exert the use of force and the devastation that has come with it. The end of this war depends upon Russia and what it decides to do next. So do the prospects for peace. In the meantime, Ukraine has a legitimate right to defend itself from the aggressor, as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Malta's position remains unchanged. Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders must be fully safeguarded. The grave humanitarian crisis generated by this full-scale invasion of Ukraine should remain in focus. Nearly 1/3 of Ukraine's entire population has been displaced. 5.9 million have been internally displaced, and more than 8 million, mostly women, have been forced to flee, which has increased their risk of sexual and gender-based violence whilst facing perilous health conditions. Equally, we are alarmed by the high number of grave human rights violations, which include killings and maiming, abductions, rape, and other forms of sexual violence against children, as well as attacks on schools and hospitals perpetrated by Russian armed forces. We are also alarmed by the systematic mistreatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian hostages by Russia in the temporarily and illegally occupied territories of Ukraine and in Russia, and demand the immediate release of all individuals unlawfully deprived of their liberty. We call on all parties to abide by their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. The result of Russia's aggression against Ukraine is not only impacting nearly 18 million people in Ukraine, but is having ripple effects all over the world. President, in closing, Malta stresses once again the overwhelming necessity for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine as a matter of utmost priority. The Security Council has the duty to distinguish between the victim and the aggressor and recognize Ukraine's right to self-defense. Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be fully upheld. We urge the Russian Federation to halt hostilities, withdraw its military forces and proxies from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized border, and embrace constructive dialogue and diplomacy as the means to establish lasting peace, stability, and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. Mozambique wishes to thank Under Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Madam Nakamisho, and all others who made their insightful briefings today. Madam President, the war in Ukraine, with its deteriorating humanitarian consequences, has been increasing in intensity. This happens despite efforts of the international community at large to bring to an end the conflict that has claimed thousands of human lives and enormous destructions of economic and social infrastructures. This conflict is of our common concern. It poses serious threat to international peace and security. Madam President, it is our considered view that the continuations of the armed conflict and violent confrontations in Ukraine is not the answer to the interests of parties and those of all the world community. In this connection, we call on the parties to the conflict to take responsibility for protecting civilians and ensure compliance with applicable international law and international humanitarian law. Mozambique wishes to reiterate its call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the return to direct negotiations between the parties as a matter of urgency and in full respect of United Nations Charter and the relevant Security Council decisions. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
I thank U.S. Nakamitsu and the briefers for their briefing. Madam President, Russia requested this meeting to discuss the issue of increasing supplies of weapons to Ukraine and the implications on diplomatic efforts to resolve the Ukraine crisis. It seems to focus on supporters of Ukraine in the current tragic situation, but we must not lose sight of the root cause. Japan has to repeat its basic position. It is Russia that initiated the unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. We therefore underscore Ukraine's right of self-defense against aggression. The arms are provided to Ukraine in order to defend itself. The international community is lending its support to Ukraine in order to stop Russia's aggression for maintaining international peace and security. By contrast, no nation should support Russia's aggression. Japan has expressed its position on the transfer of UAVs from Iran to Russia. Moreover, we are concerned by reports of arms transactions between Russia and North Korea. Any transaction of arms with North Korea is a violation of relevant Security Council resolutions and should be condemned. Japan is closely monitoring related developments. Madam President, any efforts for diplomatic resolution to end this war should have its base on justice. We all know the indisputable facts that, as stated by the overwhelming majority of the UN General Assembly, Russia's aggression is a clear violation of international law, including the UN Charter. Japan is not convinced by the argument that the efforts to support self-defense deter diplomatic efforts to end aggression. Let me pose a question. If a neighboring country launched a war of aggression against your homeland, occupied your territory, and then argued diplomatic efforts to end aggression, what would be the response? For most of the sovereign states, such an argument is unacceptable. Instead of linking support to Ukraine and various diplomatic efforts, Russia must withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from Ukraine and respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President. And I thank you, Gina Nakamitsu, for the briefing and Dr. Radchenko for his insights. We express our disappointment on the wasted time of having two persons with exactly identical positions pretendedly to lead the Council, misleading it with militant views. Sugarcoating an aggression with native English speakers will never make the aggression more digestible. It will not succeed to enforce a narrative that was false from the very start, that remains insincere and has now been totally discredited, even by those who are partners in crime. Last Friday, Prigozhin, he needs no introduction, described the invasion of Ukraine, and I quote, "a racket carried out by a corrupt elite." Colleagues, it has been said many times, and we cannot but reiterate it. When a sovereign country, an independent nation, is attacked without a shred of justification, when people are killed in their homes, hospitals, schools, and kindergarten, including at a restaurant in town, only to satisfy an insatiable imperial appetite, when a UN member is being destroyed, causing mayhem to the country, the region, the continent, and the world, condemnation is not good enough. Recalling the principles of the Charter is good, but not good enough. Calling for the war to stop while droves of missiles and illegally acquired drones destroy civilian infrastructure is good, but not good enough. There is need for more. There was and still is an urgent need to help Ukrainians who are courageously defending their freedom and their right to be themselves, to defend their land, homes, and families, to make sure that the UN Charter is not reduced to mere paper, but has a meaning and a purpose. This is exactly what many countries have been doing and will continue to do. I challenge our colleagues of the Russian Federation to point out to a single article in the UN Charter, to a single line in any UN resolution or any piece of international law that would justify their aggression. And they will not, simply because it doesn't exist. Instead, I can direct them to Article 51 of the UN Charter, which provides a very clear legal basis for individual states to offer whatever assistance to a country exercising its inherent right to self-defense in securing its sovereignty and territorial integrity. And this is a big difference, because there is one aggression and a victim, which makes both-sidism for ending the war meaningless and absurd. It is crucial to recognize that one side initiated the conflict and therefore it bears the responsibility to put an end to it. This side can be easily identified. It has consistently been condemned from 143 members of the United Nations General Assembly. There is yet another big difference. The arms transfer to Ukraine has been conducted in accordance with national legislation of the countries concerned, the Arms Trade Treaty, the obligations arising from these acts, and the assessment of risk of diversion. USG Nakamitsu just confirmed that these transfers are open data. An ad hoc commission established by the Ukrainian parliament is responsible for monitoring the entire process so that weapons are used for defense purposes and do not fall in the wrong hands. Meanwhile, Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, is using weapons illegally acquired from DPRK and Iran, violating openly and blatantly what they have been entrusted to uphold, the UN Security Council resolutions they themselves have adopted. Colleagues, a knife is a knife. It depends on what it's used for. Therefore, there are weapons to defend life, and there are weapons to kill innocent civilians, including children having dinner at a pizzeria in Kramatorsk. Therefore, Russia will not succeed to shift the responsibility of the war to others, to Ukraine as it pretends, or to other countries as it propagates. Let's not forget that everything we are talking about, including arms supply for Ukraine, is not the cause. It's just the consequence of the Russian aggression. Madam President, we have continuously raised concerns about the consequences of this war for Ukraine, for Europe, and for Russia itself. Last week, I said that the war is changing many things, including Russia, and unfortunately not for the better. The dramatic events of last weekend only reinforced our concerns. They revealed, among others, that the war of choice of Russia is not a one-way path. Actions always have consequences. And whatever the reasons, the dynamics, and their finality, internal developments in Russia send tremors beyond its borders. Because what was intended to be the Swiss knife of Russian military was morphed into a Frankenstein's monster that turned against its very creator. Those hours of total chaos in Russia have revealed many things. The world press and media are full of various analyses. But there is something worth pointing out, something that we knew and was denied. The Wagner group, the stamp of cruelty in Ukraine and in many parts in Africa, is simply a Russian tool, 100% financed by the government, as per the words of the President Putin himself. The emperor has no clothes. Therefore, the games of who could be deadlier and bloodier in Ukraine was a false competition. It was an inner struggle for money and power at the expense of poor soldiers and innocent civilians. Let me conclude, Madam President, with a last remark. The recent developments in Russia offer another insight worth mentioning. Faced with the prospect of bloodshed in power rivalry, everybody rushed to make a deal, including by pivoting 180 degrees and renouncing their own words. The main reason for such deals was not to spill Russian blood. It is very puzzling that this reasoning does not apply to those they call their brothers, the Ukrainians. This is why the political, humanitarian, and military support for Ukraine must continue and will continue. Because despite of what we hear from Russia and their backed briefers, Ukraine is right and Russia is wrong. The first shoe has been dropped. Freedom will win because it always does, and aggression will lose. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her briefing today. Her continued leadership to counter weapons diversion has been indispensable. As we have repeatedly stated in this Council, it is categorically false for Russia to allege that the international support for Ukraine's legitimate self-defense, support provided by over 50 countries, somehow constitutes a threat to international peace and security. This is a transparent and clumsy attempt by Russia to rewrite the very plain facts of this conflict. Let's be clear. It is Russia's full-scale war of aggression, its invasion of a sovereign neighbor in violation of the UN Charter, that poses the threat to international peace and security. And it is from Russia's full-scale war of aggression that Ukraine is defending itself. Russia's familiar effort to try to divert our attention through false, ever-changing allegations and disinformation is painfully obvious. Just consider, as one example, the issue of Russia's support for the Wagner Group. For years now, this Council has heard the Russian representative repeatedly deny any connection between the Russian state and the Wagner Group. On Tuesday, the Russian delegate insisted to the press outside of this chamber that the Wagner Group is just a private military company and, I quote, detached from the government, unquote. But this week, President Putin finally, nakedly, admitted that the Russian government fully finances the Wagner Group, providing almost $2 billion from state coffers in the past year alone. Putin said, and I quote, "I want to point out, and I want everyone to know about it, the maintenance of the entire Wagner Group was fully provided for by the state. From the Ministry of Defense, from the state budget, we fully financed this group," unquote. Russia has demonstrated time and time again its willingness to abuse its position on the Security Council to purposefully promote falsehoods and disinformation. We regret that Russia continues to deliberately misguide the international community, including through this meeting today. Just remember that in the lead-up to its further invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, Russia's leadership denied it had any plans to send troops into Ukraine, even while it amassed forces on Ukraine's borders. It is Russia's ongoing brutality against Ukraine's people and its campaign to destroy Ukraine's infrastructure that has rallied the international community to Ukraine's aid, both in support of its sovereignty and territorial integrity and in respect for international law. It is Russia's irresponsible nuclear rhetoric and its planned stationing of tactical nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus, which is complicit in Russia's aggression against Ukraine, that risk further aggravating an already dangerous situation. The overwhelming majority of UN member states have repeatedly made these positions clear. The United States and more than 50 member states have answered Ukraine's call to support its self-defense against Russia's aggression, and we will continue to do so for as long as it takes. These weapons are not prolonging the conflict. The Kremlin bears that responsibility alone. These arms are preventing further brutalization of Ukraine's citizens amidst the Kremlin's onslaught. Please don't forget this point. Russia's unrelenting and ruthless attacks on Ukraine and its people, and the all-too-familiar stream of false allegations to which Russia subjects us, are just further demonstrations that President Putin has no interest in meaningful diplomacy. Just 2 weeks ago, leaders from several African nations, members of a peace mission bound for Kyiv and Moscow, were forced to shelter in bunkers during their visit to Kyiv as Putin rained missiles on Kyiv. What clearer indication could we be given of the Kremlin's utter disrespect or disinterest in peace or a diplomatic resolution to Putin's war of choice? No one wants this war to end more than Ukraine and its people. But as overwhelmingly articulated by members of the UN General Assembly, the conditions for a just and lasting peace must be rooted in international law. This includes Russia demonstrating a meaningful interest in ending this war and upholding the principles of the UN Charter through action and not just empty words. It is Russia, in violation of Security Council Resolution 2231, that has procured hundreds of drones from Iran and then deployed them in attacks, killing civilians in Ukraine. If Russia had any genuine desire for a de-escalation, it would simply withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory and end its invasion. Instead, we see increased hostilities and brutality, waves of missiles wreaking havoc across Ukraine, and dangerous nuclear rhetoric. We are committed to ensuring Ukraine has the ability to exercise its right to self-defense against Russia's illegal and brutal war, while working with Ukraine to maintain the highest safeguards to ensure the weapons its partners provide are not diverted into unintended hands. We will continue to stress accountability, as we have from the beginning of this conflict, and continue to ensure robust processes to counter attempts at illicit diversion. Throughout this conflict, Ukraine has been a transparent and willing partner in these efforts. By helping Ukraine and neighboring states account for and safeguard arms and ammunition during transfer, in storage, and when deployed, strengthening border management and security in Ukraine and neighboring states, and building the capacity of relevant government agencies to deter, detect, and interdict illicit trafficking of certain weapons, we are taking concrete steps to address threats posed by the potential diversion of weapons. As we have said on many occasions since the beginning of this crisis, if Russia is serious about bringing an end to this conflict, it can simply withdraw its troops from Ukraine and end its war, illegal war of aggression. We once again call on Russia to do so, and to do so now. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señora Presidenta,
Madam President,
agradezco la exposición informativa de la alta representante para asuntos de desarme, Izumi Nakamitsu. Escuché también con atención las exposiciones de los demás ponentes. Reconozco la presencia en esta sala del representante permanente de Ucrania. Esta no es la primera ocasión que abordamos en este Consejo la cuestión de los desafíos que supone el suministro de armas en el contexto de la agresión militar de Rusia contra Ucrania. Reiteraré, por tanto, lo que ya he planteado de manera consistente en este Consejo en el transcurso de este primer semestre de 2023. Primero, debo insistir en la posición del Ecuador de rechazo a la violencia armada, la militarización y el armamentismo. Esa posición también se ha acompañado de nuestro reconocimiento del derecho de los pueblos a la legítima defensa, de conformidad con el derecho internacional y la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, incluyendo su artículo 51. Segundo, el suministro de materiales y sistemas de defensa, incluso antiaérea, contribuye a disminuir la destrucción de infraestructura y a reducir el número de víctimas civiles cuando es empleado de manera apropiada. Cualquier suministro de armas o municiones debe estar sujeto a las garantías de respeto de los principios de distinción, proporcionalidad y precaución al momento del empleo de estas, y no deben realizarse sin observar e incrementar los estándares de marcación, registro y trazabilidad, privilegiando la protección de civiles y el objetivo de la estabilidad global por encima de cualquier otra lógica de la industria, producción o distribución. Asimismo, el suministro de armas debe perseguir el propósito de la seguridad y de la protección, y no debe realizarse con el mero objetivo de ensayar nuevos materiales ofensivos en el teatro de la confrontación. Instamos a que los estados que han denunciado la invasión y participan en el suministro de armas para la defensa de la integridad territorial de Ucrania fortalezcan aún más sus controles para evitar que repuestos, partes y componentes, incluyendo electrónicos de sus propias industrias, terminen alimentando
from
los
their own
esfuerzos de guerra
manufacturers from
del
feeding
ejército de
the war
ocupación,
efforts of the occupying
en
army,
particular en la producción de artillería, misiles
particularly
y
in the
otros
manufacture
armamentos.
of artillery, missiles, and other
Rechazamos
weaponry.
además cualquier transferencia de materiales que contravenga
We also
disposiciones del
reject any
Consejo de
transfer of
Seguridad,
materials that
como es el
contravene
caso de la
Security Council
resolución
provisions such as
2231.
Resolution
Todas
2231.
estas medidas pueden contribuir y
All
evitar el
such
desvío,
measures can
la
help
propagación
prevent
y escalada del
diversion and the
conflicto
spread and escalation of
y son
conflict,
claves en la
and they are
recuperación
key
post-conflicto.
to post-conflict recovery.
En este mismo hemiciclo he reiterado una y otra vez
In this very
nuestra
chamber, I
permanente
have
preocupación por
repeatedly
los problemas para la
reiterated
paz,
our
la
continuing
seguridad y la
concern at the
estabilidad que
challenges to
supone la
peace,
corriente de
security, and
entrada de
stability
armas y
posed by the
municiones a
large-scale
gran
flow of
escala
arms and
en
ammunition
cualquier situación de
into
conflicto
any
armado.
situation of armed conflict.
También he insistido sobre la gravedad de poner armas en
I
manos de
have also
mercenarios
stressed the
y
seriousness
grupos que
of
operan al
placing
margen del
weapons
derecho
in the hands of
internacional.
mercenaries and groups operating
Hace
on the
pocos
margins
días
of international law.
observamos cómo el denominado ejército privado
A
del
few
grupo
days ago,
Wagner
we
ponía
saw
en riesgo
the
incluso
so-called
la
private
propia
army of the
estabilidad de
Wagner
Rusia.
group jeopardizing even
Llamamos
Russia's
a
own
Rusia
stability.
una vez más a detener
We
definitivamente
call on
la
Russia
ya
once
prolongada
again to
invasión
stop
sobre Ucrania,
definitively the
que
already
sigue
protracted invasion
significando
of Ukraine,
demasiada
which
destrucción y
continues to
cobrando
wreak too
demasiadas
much
vidas,
destruction and to
y que
claim too
cumpla
many
con lo
lives,
resuelto por la Corte
and to
Internacional de
comply
Justicia.
with the
Y
decisions of the
finalmente,
International Court of Justice.
defendemos la solución pacífica de las controversias
And finally, we
y
advocate the
reiteramos
peaceful
el deber de
settlement
los
of
Estados
disputes.
miembros de arreglar sus controversias
And
internacionales
we reiterate the
por
duty of
medios
member states to
pacíficos
settle their
en
international
virtud de la
disputes by
Carta.
peaceful means pursuant to the
Esto es lo
Charter.
primero que transgrede el país que agrede,
This is the
invade
first
o intenta
provision
anexar
violated by a
territorios
country that
de otro
attacks,
país por la
invades,
fuerza.
or attempts to annex territories of
Debemos
another country by
pasar de la
force.
lógica de dominación de un
We
Estado
must
sobre
move
otro,
from the logic of
que
domination
era
of
la
one state
lógica
over
de
another
las potencias coloniales del siglo
to the logic of
XIX
diplomacy.
o de
That
las
was
dictaduras
the
europeas del
logic
siglo
of the
XX
colonies
por la
of
lógica de la
the
diplomacia,
19th and 18th century.
del
We must
derecho
replace this with the
internacional,
logic of diplomacy,
enmarcados en la resolución ES
as laid out in
11-6
General Assembly
de la
Resolution
Asamblea General
ES 11/6
sobre los principios de la Carta de la ONU
on the
subyacentes
principles
a una
of the
paz
Charter
justa
of the
y
United
duradera en
Nations
Ucrania.
underlying a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine.
Reconocemos y alentamos a que se intensifiquen los esfuerzos
We
diplomáticos
recognize and
que
encourage
buscan restablecer
intensified
el diálogo
diplomatic
para
efforts
avanzar
to restore
hacia esa
dialogue,
anhelada
to move
paz
towards this
y
so
evitar
longed
llevar
for
al
peace,
mundo a una
and
guerra
to
más
avoid
amplia.
plunging the world into
Muchas
a wider
gracias.
war. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President,
我感谢驻满全高级
I
代表
thank USG
和其
and
他
High
企业通报人的
Representative
通报。
Izumi Nakamitsu and other briefers for their
乌克兰
briefings.
危机爆发以来，
Since the outbreak
大
of the
量
Ukraine
武器装备
crisis, there have been
持续流入
incessant,
战场，
massive flows of weapons and
品种和
equipment
数量
into the
持续扩
battlefield,
大，
with steadily
致命
increased
性和杀
variety
伤性
and quantity
不断提
and
升，
greater lethality
外溢
and
影响
destructive
和扩
power.
散风险
As a result,
与
the
日俱增。
spillover effects and proliferation risks
与此同
are
时，
on the
危机爆
rise.
发以来，
At the same time,
冲突地
this
区平
crisis
民伤亡
since day one
不断
has
增加，
led to mounting
民
civilian
用设施
casualties
损毁
and
日趋
devastation
严重。
of civilian facilities
黑天
in
鹅
conflict
和灰犀
areas.
牛事件
Black swan
接
and
连发
grey
生，
rhino incidents
战
have
争的
occurred
残酷
thick
性、
and fast.
严
The
峻性、
situation on the
危险
ground
性
has become
和不可预
increasingly
测性
brutal,
日益上
dire,
升，
dangerous, and
令人深
unpredictable.
感忧
We
虑。
find these deeply concerning.
当前形势下，
As things
世
stand
界
now,
更需要的
what
是
the world
停火止
needs
战，
is a
而不是
ceasefire
武器投
and
放，
cessation of fighting,
是对话
not
谈判，
pumping weapons
而不
into the
是战
battlefield.
事升
The
级，
world needs dialogue and
是劝和
negotiation,
促谈，
not escalated
而不是
fighting.
阵
The
营
world
对
needs
抗。
peace talks, not camp-to-camp
最近一段时
confrontation.
间，提出和平倡议
In
的国
recent
家
months
越
and
来越多，
weeks, we've seen a
劝
growing
和
number
促
of
谈的声
countries
音
putting
越
forward
来越
peace
强。
proposals. The
我们
voice
期
for
待有
peace
关方
talks
面
has
积
been
极回
growing.
应国
We
际社
hope
会的
that the
理
parties
性呼吁，
concerned will respond positively to the international community's call of reason, stay calm, exercise restraint, avoid escalating tensions, and engage more closely to forge consensus with a view to accumulating and creating conditions for the final settlement of the crisis. On the issue of Ukraine, China's consistent position is as follows: upholding the sovereignty and territorial integrity, abiding by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, and respecting the legitimate security concerns of all parties. All efforts, as long as they are conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis, deserve our support. China has all along stayed engaged with all the parties concerned over the Ukraine crisis, actively encouraging and facilitating peace talks. We stand ready to work with peace-loving and justice-upholding countries around the world to keep up our positive and constructive contribution to the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis, of the Ukraine issue. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Arab Emirates. I thank Under-Secretary General Izumi Nakamitsu for her briefing, and I welcome Ukraine's participation in today's meeting. As we have stated repeatedly in this chamber, it is vital to safeguard weapons during transfer, storage, and deployment. And in particular, we wish to echo the High Representative's call for vigilance against the risks of diversion. We continue to urge concerted steps by all parties with responsibility and transparency to mitigate the risks associated with arms transfers in this context. And we call on the Security Council to ensure uniform compliance with all its relevant resolutions. For 16 months, this war has devastated Ukraine. It has killed thousands, displaced millions, and inflicted billions of dollars of damage to critical infrastructure. A generation of families is forever changed. Children growing up with the trauma of living under constant bombardment, fathers that are on the front lines instead of at home, mothers on whose shoulders disproportionately falls the responsibility of providing both sustenance and security. Ukraine's fertile fields, which only recently fed hundreds of millions around the world, are transformed into battlefields, crisscrossed by hundreds of kilometers of front lines, marked by trenches reminiscent of the First World War, and a terrifying display of the capabilities of the most advanced military technologies of this century. While this may be a European war in geography, it is most certainly a global concern. Outside the theater of war, Europe is again threatened by the dynamics that once divided it into two rival camps. Political, economic, social, and cultural links, optimistic bonds of community that once brought the continent together at a time of great promise, are being progressively and almost irreparably unwound. A decoupling will have profound implications for the future of Europe and around the world. The war's impact on the global economy, on trade and commodities, energy and food has been discussed extensively in this and other fora. Today, we contend with the once unthinkable but now tangible prospect of a nuclear disaster. Countries around the world are impacted every day by this war and its consequences, with no diplomatic reprieve on the horizon. At the same time, the world must contend with an impaired post-pandemic economic recovery and debt crisis. The multilateral system is weighed down with division and polarization at precisely the moment it needs to rise up and meet the existential challenge of climate change and create a blueprint for the sustainable development agenda and economic growth. A constant call echoes from every corner of the globe in support of a peaceful resolution to this conflict. Member states have kept faith with the UN Charter, and therein lies our hope and a blueprint for what happens next. In large majorities, countries have repeatedly voted for an end to this war that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. It is time for a serious effort to that end. We cannot afford repeat cycles of approaching the precipice of disaster only to walk back at the very last moment. Too much is at stake. To that end, the UAE strongly urges a cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine and the vigorous pursuit of a just and lasting peace. Only by abiding with the UN Charter will the end of this conflict enshrine an inclusive and stable security architecture for Europe. Only by abiding with the UN Charter will the end of this conflict preserve sovereignty as the foundational building block of our open and cooperative international order for the benefit of all of us. We are under no illusions of the difficulty of the diplomacy required to end this war, but the countries with the most ability to influence the future course of events are seated around this table. We are in no need of further reminders of the consequences of the alternative. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель.
Thank you, President.
Я хотел сделать несколько комментариев в ответ на прозвучавшие сейчас отдельные тезисы. По Краматорску, которые подают как обстрел подселения.
Kramatorsk, which was allegedly shelled.
Вот сообщение российского министерства
обороны. Here's a statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense.
В результате высокоточного удара 27 июня в городе Краматорск, Донецкой Народной Республики, по пункту временной дислокации 56-й отдельной мотопехотной бригады Вооруженных сил Украины, который, добавим от себя, включал и расположенный там же отель. Уничтожены участвовавшие в штабном совещании 2 генерала до 50 офицеров Вооруженных сил Украины, а также до 20 иностранных наемников и военных советников.
Military advisors and mercenaries, foreign mercenaries.
Комментарий, как говорится, излишний.
No need
Что
to comment on
касается
that.
комментариев по Вагнеру.
Turning now to comments on Wagner. Today, a number of delegations attempted to refer to events which occurred in the Russian Federation last week. These are our domestic affairs. Nevertheless, I will say that the leadership of the Russian Federation adopted exhaustive measures to address the situation. We did this as swiftly as possible, avoiding any large-scale destabilization in the country, as well as any bloodshed amongst the civilian population. Legal actions by the mutineers resulted in a strong reaction from society. The government responded, as did the president. All of this showed that the enemies of Russia cannot use the situation to their advantage. We'd like to note that many friendly nations responded to the events and expressed their support and concern for us. In your assessments, in some of your assessments, rather, your assessments were brimming with regret about the fact that events did not take the turn you would have liked them to take. That it didn't result in a mutiny in Russia. And this couldn't have been the result, as we can now see. Although you and the regime you back in Kyiv were pinning a lot of hope on this, monitoring events with bated breath. And of course, you were severely disappointed. As for the poisonous insinuations of the representative of the UK, they were brimming with lies and traditional British cliches, especially regarding the methods of waging war, the so-called kidnapping of children, the supposed use of these children as human shields, inclusion in the report on children in armed conflict. And there were other allegations leveled at us as well. We will respond to those in due course, and this will be during the British presidency at the Security Council. The representative of the US, once again, has been lying unabashedly about a number of things, including the airstrikes targeting Kyiv during the visit of a delegation, a foreign delegation there. Although this was refuted not just by ourselves, but by the African delegations themselves who visited Kyiv and who qualified what went down as a sham provocation. I'd like to add that in order to put an end to this war, Kyiv's UK sponsors need to give orders to their vassals in Kyiv. If there is no such order, if there aren't any such signals, well, they can only mean one thing. The U.S. is not interested, has no desire to put an end to this conflict. It's only interested in the conflict continuing as it waits to be able to inflict defeat on the Russian Federation, which, as the U.S. has described it, should be a strategic defeat. And may I tell you, you won't see the day when that happens. Last but not least, I'd like to once again thank Mr. Blumenthal for their very sober, their very informative assessments. The truth you are disseminating is not to the liking of some in the room today. We'd like to apologize for the actions of those colleagues who try to turn your briefings into a profanation. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Under-Secretary General Nakamitsu. I also recognize the representative of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Today, he has again described to us what the way out should look like according to Russia. In a nutshell, this is a situation in which Russia has enough weapons to attack Ukraine anytime it so decides, while Ukraine has no weapons to defend itself. In reality, it would mean that bloody attacks like Tuesday's missile strike on Kramatorsk, Donetsk region, could happen on a permanent basis without any hindrance. 12 killed, including 3 children, and 60 wounded. That was the outcome of Russian missile hitting a local restaurant in the city center. And by the way, what can be a more authoritative and reliable source of information than the Russian Ministry of War? The Russian armed forces are not getting tired of proving the validity of the Secretary General's decision to list them and affiliated armed groups in his annual report on children and armed conflict. This is exactly the list which the Russian army belongs on, after all the horrible crimes they have committed and continue to commit daily against children in Ukraine. And it is not because Ukraine receives weapons that these 3 young girls were killed by Russia in Kramatorsk, but because Russia still has weapons and remains willing to kill. I urge those who seem to be concerned about weapon transfers to conflict zones not to forget the difference between the aggressor and the defender who fights to survive. At the same time, I cannot but note that the issue of illicit arms trafficking in and out of Russia appears to be more than pertinent and timely following the weekend's events in Russia. On numerous occasions, including in this chamber, Ukraine has drawn the attention of the UN community to the security threats stemming from the Russian practices of recruiting people with criminal backgrounds for proxy armed formations, of equipping these formations with a whole range of conventional weapons and thus helping them evolve into de facto parallel armies. This was the case with the infamous Wagner group, known for its crimes in the Middle East, Africa, and Ukraine. While operating there, the Wagner group used weapons that were not subject to any control mechanisms, including internal Russian ones. For decades, Russia has multiplied crises throughout the world, trying to hide its responsibility behind such proxy structures. Finally, Russian aggression has incrementally started returning to its home harbor. It turned out that Russia, which so generously labeled other nations as failed states, showed failure and the incapability of its own governance starting from the highest level. The whole world witnessed the paralysis of the authorities when armed mercenary units easily crossed the state border of the Russian Federation, and when they took the city of Rostov-on-Don of more than 1 million people without a fight, when they were advancing with little resistance towards the Russian capital and shooting down Russian aircraft and helicopters from modern anti-aircraft missile systems along their way. Saturday's events also highlighted that the safety and security of weapon arsenals on Russian territory are easily compromised by Wagner-like armed formations. There are several lessons that the international community should draw from these events. While proving its inadequacy by continuing the war against Ukraine with no chance of success, Putin's regime also demonstrated it is no longer capable of controlling its own country. Saturday's advance on Moscow was stopped only by the decision of the Wagner chief following the engagement of Belarusian dictator Lukashenko. Putin's regime has been built on lies and hypocrisy. For years, Putin lied that the Wagner Group had no affiliation with the Russian government. Putin's quotation from his press conference with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel in January 2020 about the presence of the Wagner Group in Libya. Let me quote. If there are Russian citizens there, they do not represent the interests of the Russian state and do not receive money from the Russian government. End of quote. Another quotation from Putin's press conference with French President Macron in February 2022 about the activities of the Wagner Group in Mali. I quote, regarding Wagner, as I have already said, the Russian government has nothing to do with it. End of quote. And this week, Putin confessed that the group was fully funded by the state and has received 86.3 billion Russian rubles, which is equivalent to $1 billion US from the state budget between May 2022 and May 2023. 1/3 of Russian regions have annually budgets smaller than this amount. Additionally, the Russian government allocated 110 billion rubles, that is approximately $1.29 billion US, for insurance payments for Wagner Group fighters. These expenditures do not include the equipment and weapons the Wagner Group were generously given all these years. It was not only the habit of lying to everyone and everywhere that Putin's confession revealed. The case of the Wagner Group, which has been a product of the Kremlin from the very beginning, also showed that Putin and his cronies are not reliable or predictable even one step ahead. This regime continues to pose an existential threat not only for its neighbors and other regions throughout the world, but also for Russia itself. Madam President, Putin's regime will only keep degenerating while generating new crises and threats until it finally collapses. The international community should therefore address the Russia crisis as one of priority tasks. I reiterate that the military defeat of Russia in Ukraine, ensuring accountability for the crimes committed, and international control over the Russian military arsenal should be the necessary elements of the resolution of the Russian crisis. Ukraine continues to do its best in order to survive and to stop the evil. We are grateful to all responsible nations that support us, including by supplying necessary weapons. Their use has been an element of Ukraine exercising the inherent right to self-defense under the above-mentioned Article 51 of the UN Charter for a noble goal to restore respect to the UN Charter. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, we call on the Security Council to keep its eye on the Russian crisis and to take the necessary steps to address many imminent threats and challenges that this failing state poses to the world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
dance? A bright cloud of music, shall we fly? Shall we dance? Shall we then say goodnight and mean goodbye? Or perchance, when the last little star has left the sky, shall we still be together with our arms around each other? And shall you be my new romance, on the clear understanding that this kind of thing can happen? Shall we dance? Shall we dance? Shall we dance?